One of the more common narratives that you will hear within the Western political discourse when it comes to potential conflict between Taiwan and China is how costly of an invasion it would be for China. And even though I generally don't disagree with this assessment, today I want to give you a different perspective that isn't often talked about within popular Western discourse. First, we need to understand that the whole game plan when it comes to Taiwan's defense against China is rooted in the necessity for Taiwan to buy enough time for the United States and its allies to come to its support. And although there are US military bases nearby, such as the ones in Philippines and Okinawa, to assist in defense, it's believed by Taiwanese military experts that it would take the United States weeks to come to full assistance in case of conflict, meaning that Taiwan will need to pull their own weight especially early on. But when you actually look at the quality of Taiwanese military, you begin to question whether they can even hold for a couple of hours against a Chinese attack. For over a decade, Taiwan has only required 4 months of mandatory military services. Aside from the fact that 4 months has been nowhere near enough to get these young recruits ready for any potential conflict, the training itself has been called into question, with soldiers spending most of the limited time doing housekeeping and maintenance work rather than actual training. And when Taiwanese conscripts do train, the actual training itself is also abysmal as well, with Taiwanese military refusing to allow conscripts to practice using real weapons because it could hurt the recruits, thus making a lot of young conscripts feel like they would just be cannon fodders in the time of conflict. Commanders will even refuse to teach conscripts because it supposedly wouldn't make any differences. And this sentiment seems to be shared by the conscripts themselves, citing that the mandatory military service has not been a very useful experience. Taiwanese military conscription is oftentimes described as just a summer camp by the Taiwanese public, with 78% of respondents aged 20 and older citing that they have no confidence at all that Taiwan could defend itself, with many youth calling it a total waste of time, and also with some surprisingly showing signs of indifference to China taking over Taiwan. The Taiwanese government and its leaders have acknowledged these issues, and Taiwan has already increased the mandatory military training from 4 months to a year in 2024. But Taiwan previously already had 2 years of mandatory military service in the early 2000s, and the reason why it was scrapped in the first place was precisely because of the poor training and quality. Taiwan has also announced military reforms, but it has also announced multiple military reforms in the past as well that hasn't really fixed anything. In fact, there's an op-ed written on Brookings Institution by a professor that specializes in defense strategy back in 2010, talking about how Taiwan is finally reforming its military to meet the challenges for combat in the 21st century. It's been 14 years since then, and the reform seems to have made poor progress. Additionally, unlike in other countries where there are mandatory military training for all genders, Taiwan only requires mandatory military training for men, and the female soldiers that do voluntarily conscript themselves are often given non-combat roles. Remember that there are more females than males in Taiwan. This means that majority of the country actually aren't even combat ready, and for the male population that are combat ready, the training itself is outdated and impractical, with heavy emphasis on bayonet training, but lacking instruction in urban warfare strategies or modern weapons like drones, with training done using old rifles that aren't even readily available for all soldiers to even practice with. In fact, the morale in Taiwanese military is so bad that you have Taiwanese soldiers abandoning their outposts and defecting to China by swimming across the waters, with defection actually happening periodically. There was one particular incident recently where a Taiwanese soldier had to write an SOS signal by the beach because the island they were stationing at ran out of critical food, with soldiers not being able to get in contact with anyone for resupply. Now, Taiwan also has professional military force that actually joined the military as a career rather than for mandatory services. But one of the big problems is that these professional military members tend to be nationalists, as in Chinese nationalists. And we know this because of the uncomfortable amount of Taiwanese veterans that are pro-China. For example, just last year, Taiwanese Veteran Affairs Council had to ask its veterans to stop visiting China for events. We see retired Taiwanese military general Xu Linong meeting prominent leaders of the Chinese government, including President Xi Jinping, with another retired Taiwanese military general, Cao An-kuo, coming out calling for a coup against the Taiwanese government and for Taiwanese military to fight alongside China for Chinese reunification, and another retired Taiwanese Air Force general, Tsai Ing-chao, visiting China and citing that both Taiwan and China are pretty much one and the same under Chinese nationalism. And this Air Force general was recently quoted saying that China has every right to fly its warplanes in Taiwanese airspace as Taiwan is part of China's territory. In fact, this sort of exchange between retired professional veterans going to China has been a very regular occurrence since 2009, with the numbers picking up. The scary thing for the current Taiwanese government is that they actually don't really know where some of their professional military soldiers and their allegiance lie. We know that China has compromised quite deeply into the professional Taiwanese military ranks, with former professional Taiwanese military members being charged with violating national security law enough times that has made the US and Taiwanese intelligence extremely uncomfortable. Obviously, professional soldiers tend to be way more patriotic and nationalistic than your average person, and this seems to be a double-edged sword for the Taiwanese government. Because on one hand, they might be loyal to the sovereignty of Taiwan, but on the other hand, they might feel a strong connection to their cultural root as a Chinese. And we see this division of nationalism at play between the two largest parties in Taiwan, the KMT and the DPP, with KMT's previous leader and former president of Taiwan even visiting mainland China recently with a unifying message, "We are all Chinese," and asking the Taiwanese youth to remember their Chinese root. And it's not just the political divide that we're seeing. Taiwan has also been experiencing cultural fragmentation in the past several decades. There's a really popular belief in the West that Taiwan is the successor of the real Chinese culture, especially after the communist takeover of the mainland, where Mao attempted to erase aspects of Chinese culture during the Cultural Revolution. Yet what we see on the ground today is a completely different story. Taiwan has increasingly embraced liberalism and westernization, with some Taiwanese people distancing themselves from their Chinese roots. This is in contrast with mainland China, which has turned back to its cultural roots to rekindle their distinct identity to unify the country under nationalism. And we see this difference reflected in Taiwanese and Chinese media. Of course, for China, the state is deeply involved in the television programs, and these cultural celebrations double as a tool to strengthen nationalism. Whereas in Taiwan, the media seems to show what is more relevant for the taste of the Taiwanese audiences. But there is no doubt that Taiwan is attempting to move away from their Chinese cultural roots. Taiwan has even begun education reform to reduce the role of classical Chinese literatures and coverage of Chinese history, citing that although Taiwan will still cover some classics, that ultimately Chinese history is no longer Taiwanese history anymore. Probably the most extreme example of Taiwan's rejection of its Chinese root is when we see pro-Taiwanese independence people identifying much more strongly with Japanese identity. For those who don't know, Taiwan used to be a colony of the Japanese Empire, and a lot of Taiwanese people actually look back at their country's past under Japanese occupation very positively. In Taiwan, people have set up monuments celebrating Taiwanese volunteers who have directly assisted the Japanese Imperial Army's conquest of Asia, the same Imperial Army that fought against the very ancestors of many living in Taiwan today. Taiwan has also erected a bronze statue of Shinzo Abe, the former Prime Minister of Japan who was assassinated back in 2022. We also have anti-China groups even visiting Japan's infamous shrine, where Class A war criminals of Imperial Japan Army are honored. We see these Taiwanese groups make trips to Japan to give their respect for these soldiers, whom again are the very soldiers that fought against the very ancestors of many people living in Taiwan. Tsai Ing-wen, the former president of Taiwan, is also quite notoriously pro-Japanese, describing Japan-Taiwan relationship as familial, and she actually gets a ton of support from pro-Japanese youth in Taiwan who strongly identify with Japanese culture. One funny criticism that she would receive from nationalists during her time as a president is that she only really tweets in Japanese and English, despite the fact that she is Chinese and is a leader of a country that speaks Chinese. The current president of Taiwan, William Lai, is also not very shy about his friendly position to Japan either. Additionally, with the liberalization of Taiwan, Taiwan's cultural outlook has been heavily leaning towards Western liberal democracies. Taiwan has legalized LGBTQ marriages despite initial disapproval from the public. Taiwan is now poised to bring mass immigration, specifically from countries like India, and although there is no polling data available for how the general Taiwanese feel about this move on immigration, the labor minister did make a comment to appeal to the public after poor reactions, citing that they will only bring Indians with light skins. And for those who still believe in the Chinese nationalist identity and are a bit more conservative, there's a possibility that all this stuff I just mentioned isn't going to sit well, which could further cause more fragmentations within Taiwanese society. On the other hand, this cultural fragmentation is actually the argument that a lot of Taiwanese people use as to argue why China and Taiwan should not unify, because Taiwan and China's identity has strayed so far away from each other that Taiwan's culture has become distinctively different from that of the mainland. But given the rising tensions between China and Taiwan, you could argue that this further fragmentation makes things unstable for Taiwan's prospect of unity when defending themselves against China. Meanwhile, there are other issues that call into question how much Taiwanese people would see it as a worthwhile to fight for their autonomy when the time actually comes. Remember how I previously mentioned that there are some youth in Taiwan who expresses indifference to whether the region is controlled by China or not. Taiwan is oftentimes sold in the West as this prosperous and thriving nation in Asia. Yet on the ground, Taiwan actually faces a lot of economic challenges ahead that have many young people demoralized. Taiwan is experiencing one of the biggest brain drains in the world, with 1 in 10 Taiwanese people leaving the country for better opportunities abroad. One such country that young Taiwanese move to is China, with many Taiwanese leaving to China for better economic opportunities. In fact, the situation got so bad that Taiwan actually had to pass a law that forbid young Taiwanese people from leaving Taiwan to China for security reasons. Housing is also very expensive in Taiwan due to the limited geography, alongside one of the lowest wages in the developed world. Taiwan has also recently entered a technical recession as its economy continues to buckle. If you aren't providing adequate quality of life for your citizens and a reason to fight to protect that quality of life, then it shouldn't be that shocking that people are less willing to fight when the time comes. And this, in my opinion, is a bigger security concern. According to Taiwan Foundation for Democracy, in 2021, 72.5% of Taiwanese people are willing to defend Taiwan in case China tries to forcefully unify the country. However, we have another polling conducted by one of Taiwan's major magazine publisher in the same year, and their polling data shows that 51.3% of Taiwanese have expressed that they are unwilling to defend Taiwan in case of war. There are a couple of reasons for why there might be such a massive discrepancies between the polling data. It could be perhaps due to conflict of interest, the methodology of the data collection itself, or even the timing of the data collection depending on what is trending in the news. Obviously, some of these reasonings are more likely than others, but ultimately, what matters is that this uncertainty isn't really going to help give a lot of assurances when it comes to Taiwan's ability to defend itself. Now, it's still important to emphasize that despite everything I mentioned, Taiwan still desires to maintain the status quo, which is de facto independence. And we see this very much reflected in Taiwanese politics. If you were to ask the average young Taiwanese person what they think the remedy is for the difficulties that a lot of young people in Taiwanese society face, a lot of them will actually tell you that the solution is more liberalism and to become more like the West. So this direction that Taiwan is going isn't really that surprising. Additionally, when the time for an actual conflict comes, it's possible that everyone in Taiwan can put aside their differences and unite. And in many ways for the current Taiwanese government, the rising tensions between China is a blessing in disguise, because they can hyper-focus on the impending threat of China rather than address some of the key social and economic challenges of the Taiwanese people. But the question is, how long can the current Taiwanese government continue to rely on this? Ultimately, when you consider all these factors, such as the problems relating to Taiwan's military, to the fragmentation of culture, as well as social and economic issues, it shouldn't be too crazy to assume that this disjointedness could cause some serious issues when the time comes for Taiwan to fight, especially against a country that is much stronger and bigger than they are. And it is no wonder that the lack of seriousness from Taiwan has prompted the United States to escalate the situation. Taiwan's future will be determined by how much they can stabilize their internal affairs and to improve the everyday affairs of the people. Unfortunately, Taiwan has not proven to be able to overcome such challenges yet. This is why it's important for everyone around the world to be aware of all the possible scenarios, because a war within the Taiwan Strait could very quickly evolve into the end of human history.